Welcome back to the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I am your host, Josh Luck, and I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Christopher Leppert.
What's up?
Doing pretty good, Chris. How you doing?
I'm giddy, like a schoolgirl right now. We're about to talk about one of probably two of the best things you could talk about when you're talking about deer hunting. And
Yes.
It's not thermals, so it's got to be oaks.
Before we get into that and introduce our guest, for anyone that's wondering, Sklinner is not on this one because he is getting married at the time of this recording. Well, getting married this week, so congratulations to him. He is a little busy this week, just this week. I don't think he's busy any other time.
Yeah. Well, I'm as much as it's crushing my soul right now, we're gonna hold all the jokes back. I'm gonna give him an ounce of respect during his wedding week.
But as you alluded to, so when this releases, this is a time of year that most people are typically thinking about shifts in the woods, whitetail shifts, primarily in relation to food, right? Ag's changing, going from green to brown, and most people tend to think that, the deer are shifting towards oaks. So to help us cover this topic, we have on today Mr. Moriah Boggess. Moriah, how you doing?
Doing great. Happy to be here, guys.
Yeah. Really, I've mentioned you before to Chris, and this has been, I guess, a few years now as someone that I've been dying to have on the podcast to talk about oaks and acorns and all that. I believe I first heard you talk about this subject a few years ago. It was on the MSU Deer Lab podcast with Bronson and Dr. Damaris. Some of the information that you were discussing was very good and very applicable to a lot of our hunting strategies. So I've been dying to have this conversation.
Well, I'm excited to have it. When you mentioned wanting to talk about oaks, I was here for it because that's right up my alley. Both from a biologist perspective, there's a lot of applications of understanding oak ecology and managing properties for deer and my background in research. But to me too, I just love nerding out about it. I love being able to ID all the different oak species that we have in the East and love following those oaks year to year, seeing which ones are masting and whatnot. And then most importantly, I guess to this conversation, the fun part, sitting underneath one of those oaks when there are a bunch of acorns under it and deer too.
Yeah.
And I do love hunting them a lot. So
yeah. Over the years, there's been, I have found a lot of different nuances. Like there's some general thoughts behind like targeting and hunting oaks. And as I've gotten more and more into just learning about tree identification and all that, and just being in the woods more, scouting more, I think there are different nuances that are a little bit different than what I've primarily been taught in the past, so to speak. But we'll get into all that. Before we get into that, I want to give our listeners a good idea of who you are and your background a little bit. We do that with anyone that's new on the podcast. So if you can give our listeners an idea of just your general background growing up into hunting, and then how that has led into some of your schooling, your graduate work, and then your career.
yeah, so like a lot of wildlife biologists, I did a 4-year undergraduate degree in wildlife science, and that was kind of the start of things. But from there, I studied at the MSU Deer Lab, so down in Mississippi, for my master's degree. And that research that I did was pretty much focused around deer and oaks in different ways. So one of the projects I did was looking at the effects of masting or oak acorn production and how that affected deer use of the forest underneath those trees, as well as their effects on those plant communities. And then I also did research while there on fire and how fire affected essentially consumption of acorns. So, imagine acorns that get burnt in a prescribed fire. What is the fate of those acorns? And so after my master's, I went on to Indiana, where I worked as the deer biologist for DNR there for about a year. and I actually met my wife there, and we ended up moving to North Carolina, and I worked in North Carolina again as the deer biologist for Wildlife Resources Commission there in that state for 2 years. So since then, I now work in the private sector for a company out of Mississippi called Wildlife Investments, and we work with landowners all over the place. Myself, along with a lot of other biologists, consulting with landowners, writing management plans, assessing their habitat annually or semi-annually, and writing up prescriptions. So part of that, of course, is upland deciduous hardwood management, mostly oaks, and then of course a lot of pine work down south. So I get to do a little bit of everything these days, and honestly, the fun part is being able to talk hunting like this. A lot of days riding around with landowners, I get to talk hunting, and it is kind of cool it's very cool to be in a job where you get to think about deer all the time.
Man, I feel like I might have missed my calling. I'd jump all over being able to just go nerd out on trees and deer all day.
Yeah, that would be a very, very fun job. Just going around identifying just the different species, and then being able to, discuss with another hunter how to best manage the property for the deer population. I mean, that's one of the reasons why at some point in my life I would like to own a piece of land, just to be able to manage it myself and just to learn the different aspects of management. I just think it's very fascinating.
It is. The coolest thing, deer management, turkey management, whatever you're interested in, it's all plant management. And this is why this conversation today is so cool from the hunter's perspective, is recognizing that to be a good hunter, the same as to be a good manager, you have to understand plants. We all love deer and love hunting deer and whatnot, but if you're really going to be a good deer hunter, you have to know the deer's target, which is the plants. And so like any herbivore, you're managing for that herbivore, you're really managing for what they eat. And so I love kind of being in that niche, because I'm a plant guy and I'm a deer guy, and habitat is where those two coincide.
Amen to that. It's very interesting to me how I probably, God, we talk to so many people like at the shows, and just if we're out and about in a public place at a, firearm store, sporting goods store, whatever. And then you talk to people on the internet all the time, right? And it kind of surprises me at how little people know about all the different plants in general, trees, whatever, the habitat, if you will, how everything's connected and how it's designed to work, not only to, nourish them as far as like nutrients and everything, but also, from a hydration perspective when it comes to like browse and stuff for deer, and then, cover and everything. And so that's really upped our game tremendously when it just comes to finding animals. And that's really, like, don't get me wrong, we want to go and first sit kill every big buck we ever find, but that's not realistic. And furthermore, at the end of the day, if you're on deer, if you're on elk, if you're on turkeys, whatever state, you really can't beat that by very much. That's at least encouraging, and you're really having a good time, and you can walk away and be like, man, that was a good time I got to watch, because that's really what we all are. We're a bunch of freaking geeks who like to watch animals interact with and navigate their own environment while hoping that they have no clue that you're there. At least that's how I look at it. It's like being on Nat Geo, only in person, and then you might get to leave with some hindquarters that day.
Yes.
Yeah, the cool thing about being a observer, to your point, Chris, is obviously you can learn a lot about the animal, and as hunters we get to see, we get to learn so much about what deer are doing during that 3 or 4 month hunting season. And one thing I'm quite fond of doing is shed hunting, and that gets me out in the woods looking specifically for deer sign for another 2 months or month and a half of the year. But there you're not viewing deer at all. When you're shed hunting, you are focused completely. Everything you learn is just focused completely on what sign deer have left behind. And this is all full circle back to plants. The more time you spend in the woods in that setting where you were just looking for the clues deer have left, the more you start to lean on the disturbance in the plant community, whether that's browse tips of small shrubs or tree seedlings or acorn caps or crushed acorns, overturned leaves, all the different things. And when you apply that again, being in the woods other times of the year, you start to put together sort of this puzzle of what deer are doing on that property, whether you own it or it's public, access. You start to learn what deer are kind of doing all the other months of the year. And I'm not convinced or I am convinced rather, that really helps when it comes time to hunting. Even if, let's say, jewelweed, something they're going to be eating in May and June, and it grows along the sides of streams and whatnot. And I always notice deer browsing jewelweed a lot. Now, by the time hunting season ever comes in, jewelweed's long gone. But by being able to recognize very readily, walking through the woods, this is what deer are going to be eating and this is what they're not, it gives me so much more confidence in the fall to be able to, again, while scouting day of or even pre-scouting it before a weekend, identify deer browse, know what you're looking for, and be able to even identify plants from afar, 50 yards, 100 yards, so that you can climb up before you walk right into what the deer are coming in to eat, And again, like I just back to this idea of plant identification and being a woodsman and being able to recognize what deer eat. I think there's a lot to it. And the biggest thing it gives you is confidence.
Yeah. I remember feeling a lack of that very subject. And so 2022 is when I learned to pay attention and start really breaking things down and slow down and, again, pay attention. I can't say that enough. And I was fortunate enough to kill on my first sit here in Ohio, and on the 7th sit for the year, 6th in Kentucky, I killed another buck. So then I went to Indiana, and I remember following the food sources. I was scouting my way in, and the first time I went out there, I find a pin oak that's raining, and I blew it. I'd had 3 bucks and 8 sits, right? But I blew the shot. And I remember thinking, well, I'll come back next weekend and I'll kill one off of that pin oak. And then I showed up and it's not dropping a thing. There's no acorns under it, nothing. No, the scrape that was near it, hadn't been touched. And I thought, well, crap. So then, and I'm in like completely flat country, so I can't even say, oh, go up to the ridgetop up there and, you'll find some red oaks and chestnuts or, whatever. And I start looking around and noticed that on the riverbanks, I would find a lot of the bigger oaks. And I started finding some dropping reds. And I thought, oh, cool, this will work out. So then I come back the next weekend and they're not dropping anymore. And then I found this one. I still don't know what it was. It might have been a burr, but it was like, I'm telling you, the acorns were like that big, and they were covered in the big hairy shells or the caps, and it covered like probably more than half of the acorn. Would that be a bur oak?
That's a burr.
They're the biggest acorns I've ever seen. I don't know how a deer would be able to like navigate breaking that down at all. But it was really depressing because I thought, well, man, I'm chasing my tail at that point. I have no idea what to prepare for. But that's where now with our scouting, it's very like once you find a deer, everything is so anticipatory now. You're like, all right, what are you going to do then? Not now, then. What can we find out?
Yeah. It goes back to what you said, Moriah, as far as like pieces of a puzzle. I mean, the more you're out there, the more you're scouting, and Chris and I are figuring this out year after year, is when you spend that time on a property and really breaking it down and identifying these different plants and the food availability, you kind of develop this anticipatory kind of reaction to the deer of like, okay, they've kind of used up this food source and the pressure's coming in. I know where this next food source is that they tend to hit, and you can kind of go there and almost anticipate some of these shifts that you see. And we've done a whole episode on anticipating a shift. Chris, what episode was that?
I literally just shared it with a buddy of ours today.
You did. I can't. It's called Beating the Shift.
I have a number in my head, but I don't want to say it because I don't want to lead anybody astray. But
But if you go back, it's called Beating the Shift. Whitetail Tactics that produce. It is episode 182. Yeah.
Okay.
We talk about a lot of this. But that kind of ties right into what I had mentioned earlier, as far as, these general kind of thoughts I had initially had when I first started, hunting public land and thinking of even targeting, oaks in general, right? It was just, oh, deer hit white oaks early and deer hit red oaks later. But I don't, now that I've been scouting more and doing this longer, right, there's some nuances there. I don't think people give too much thought to the when, where, why, when it comes to these different oak species. And I thought we could kind of just start broad, breaking this down, and maybe go over some of the more common oak species that are found in this area. Go over some of the white oaks, some of the red oaks, and then maybe some easy identification pieces to that, and then we'll go further down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, that sounds good. I definitely heard that growing up the same, that white oaks were the early season food and red oaks were regarded as late season if they ate it, and they would only eat it when they're out of food. And part of the long held belief of why deer don't eat red oaks is because they're higher in tannins, which they are. That's been in general across that group. Red oaks are generally higher in tannins. But deer will eat red oaks. I mean, I've shot deer early season on red oaks if that's what they're eating. That's what they're eating. But yeah, so just to start out, we'll start out real broad here. We already thrown this term around a lot today, and it's all over hunting media: red oak versus white oak. And people often talk about that as if those are species. Those are actually subgroups of oaks. There's actually way more than those two subgroups of oaks on other continents, but in North America, those are the two native subgroups that we have, are the red oaks and white oaks. And first off, because there's going to be confusion here, there is a white oak species.
They need to remove
and
from that. Because that's what gets everybody. Is a black oak a
Yeah.
red oak or a white oak? It's like, oh my God.
And this next part, I don't say this to be pompous, but white oak is Quercus alba. That's the scientific name. Another white oak would be Quercus, what is it, lavigata, I think, which is like overcup oak. Quercus alba, and this is the only one I'm going to use a Latin name on, but I'll throw it in there just to make sure we're talking about that tree. That is probably the most common oak species across the East. Real light, shaggy bark. It has those big, bright green leaves. They're kind of glossy. They're not very fuzzy. It's got that classic looking acorn. It's one of the earliest ones to drop. It's an upland species. You will find it down into some damper areas, but generally it's mid-slope, or it's the lower part of the slope to the upper 2/3 of the slope. Or I should say the lower 2/3. The very upper third of slopes, whereas the very dry, especially in Appalachians, sometimes you won't see white oaks up that far. And honestly, when people say white oak, most of the time that's what they're talking about.
Yep.
But again, the white oak subgroup, it's actually a subgenus, has a lot of other white oak species. So you mentioned swamp chestnut oak, other white oak species, overcup oak, which I mentioned before, chinkapin oak. Those are all white oaks. And so white oaks in general, if you look at a white oak leaf, they can come in, doing it already. I'm talking about the subgroup of white oaks. If you look at a leaf from one of the species across that subgroup, in general, and this is kind of the rule of thumb, there will not be bristle tips on the ends of the lobes of that leaf. So imagine an oak leaf. It's got maybe 12 or 15 lobes or points on it. On the tips of those on the tips of those lobes, red oaks will have a bristle tip. And it honestly feels like a little bristle, almost like a little pricker. It's not that sharp, but a little bristle tip, and white oaks won't. And in general, that holds true. Another difference between those two groups, and there are exceptions to this, but in general, a lot of the white oaks have lighter colored bark. Again, there are exceptions, but a lot of our red oaks have a lot darker colored bark. another difference between white oaks and red oaks is that so with the way white oaks develop their acorns in 1 year, red oaks take 2 years. So the red oak flowers from this spring of 2025 won't mature into acorns until the fall of 2026. The acorns that drop this year, fall of 2025, will be from flowers that were on those red oaks in the spring of 2024. So that's one major difference just in the biology of red oaks versus white oaks. And when we get down the road here in a little bit, we start talking about masting cycles and sort of the 1 year is this species and 1 year it's another. That, of course, that maturation time kind of comes into play there, because if we have a really bad acorn production spring, then that's going to hurt our white oaks for that year, the year that we had that bad spring. But it's not going to do anything to our red oaks because those are from the spring before. And so it's kind of cool. Nature has that built in. Those two groups are so different. There's this offset. So while there are some years that are truly really bad mast years, and I've seen it where there's pretty much no acorns, usually something's producing, due in part because of those differences in acorn production. So before we jump into red oaks, the different red oaks real quick, I do want to just go back to the species of white oaks and go through those that we mentioned for identification purposes. We talked about Quercus rubra, white oak proper, and sort of where it occurs. And of course, it's really common. When you are looking at white oaks, chinkapin is pretty similar in site selection to Quercus alba, or just the regular white oak.
Mm-hmm.
Chinkapin oak, though, its leaf, those lobes are not nearly as deep. It almost is like if you put all your fingers together, the palm of your hand, there's very little. It's almost like your finger sticking out the palm of your hand. There's very little for lobes, protruding off the margin of that leaf. And chinkapin actually looks pretty similar to swamp chestnut oak leaves. The difference between the two is site selection in a big way. Swamp chestnut oaks are big time bottomland oaks. They're down in the water. They're in floodplains that will hold water for part of the year, whereas chinkapins are generally higher up the slopes. Chinkapins have a little bit smaller leaves and smaller acorns. When you're down in those bottoms, it's sometimes called basket oak or cow oak, swamp chestnut oak, all the same thing. Those are those really big acorn producing trees down in bottomlands, and very popular hunting tree all across the South because those acorns, they're about 1 inch in diameter. Deer seem to really like them. And those trees, when they have a good year, they produce a whole lot of acorns, which equals a whole lot of food. The bark itself is, again, white and real shaggy, similar to the other white oaks. But again, where it grows is quite different. It's in that really wet area. The other white oak that you'll find in those really wet areas is overcup oak. And overcup has a really weird looking leaf. It looks kind of like normal white oak, but I don't know how to describe it. It just looks weird. when you get used to IDing different plants and all, like sometimes you can tell by looking at one, but it's really hard to explain the difference. The lobing is really irregular on overcup oak versus white oak. And when you see one next to a white oak, the leaves just look different. But the biggest thing with overcup oak that you'll find for a good identification is that the cap of that acorn will cover the acorn itself anywhere from 99% to 80%.
Wow.
And it's kind of variable by tree. And I've noticed that some trees really produce a really big cap and you can barely see the tip of that acorn. And then others you can see, maybe the bottom quarter of it. In some preliminary work that I did trying to look at like selection of acorns and whatnot, overcups were the last thing to seem to be eaten. And anecdotally, when I'm out in the woods, I've paid attention to overcup oaks enough times to feel like they're very rarely eaten by deer, to the point where if I'm scouting and I see overcup, I just keep walking. I really don't pay any attention. And I'm not saying deer don't eat it, because they 100% do, but it seems like it's much more poorly selected. And I think it has to do with that cap covering it.
Yeah.
Oh, it makes sense. This isn't the same as a post oak, is it?
No, and I'm glad you brought up post oak because I did exclude that one. Post oak is a upland species, and so going back to Quercus alba, white oak proper, and chinkapin oaks, those were the two kind of upland white oaks we just talked about. Post oak will grow on those same dry sites and then even drier. In the Appalachians, sometimes you'll find post oaks up on pretty dry ridge tops where you wouldn't even find white oaks. Post oaks are really cool in that their leaf, it has a cross shape in its pattern, in its lobing pattern, and the actually the scientific name is Quercus. Well, it's Quercus stellata, like stellata.
Yeah.
And I've always heard it described that leaf is almost like a crucifix.
Yeah.
And it kind of looks like that. It looks like a star, or it looks like a cross, and the arms of the cross kind of get larger at the end for those lobes. That's post oak, and it has a really small acorn. I've seen deer eat post oak quite a bit. Just kind of depending on the year. Sometimes they're wearing them out. Other times it seems like they're eating something else instead of the post oaks. But they produce small acorns, but they'll produce quite a bit.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the white oaks that I pay attention to. There are other species of white oaks, but then you start to get into some of the really localized species. Like there's some that you only find in a couple little spots in Alabama, Mississippi, and whatnot. Those that we covered are the main ones.
How do you feel about the burr? Is that localized?
Well, yeah. So burr that's a good one, and it is sort of localized. The Mississippi River drainage, mostly the Midwest. There are some that you'll find down in the Mississippi, but they're a little bit more rare there.
Okay.
Deer seem to like burr pretty well, but to be honest, I don't have much experience hunting over them. Sure. Most of the hunting that I do in the Midwest, like in Indiana, I'm in uplands, and we don't really have burr oaks there. But the acorn, so for folks listening, Chris was describing it earlier, the burr oak acorn is huge. I mean, it is a big tree in all regards. It's got a really big, crazy looking leaf. It almost looks like a combination between a swamp chestnut oak leaf and like a post oak leaf. Like it's like this weird looking hybrid leaf. It's not a hybrid, it's its own species. But yeah, it sounds like you've had some good experience hunting over it.
A little bit. I've seen some feed sign, but again, I don't find a whole lot myself. But again, I'm very, I've been able to identify oaks here and there, like red versus white and so on. But aside from that, it took till 2021, 22 before I could really dive in. And now I'd say I'm probably like significantly better than average, but not Mr. Moriah, like, king of it. I don't know names, that's for damn sure.
I will tell you this. When I don't know a plant, I've got two different apps on my phone, and I would tell everyone here, one is the Seek app, which is an app by iNaturalist, and then the other one is iNaturalist itself. Mm-hmm. And I use that to ID forbs all the time and grasses when I find something cool out in the woods that I don't know. And that can be 100% used to ID oaks. So if you're out scouting and you're wanting to learn your oaks, it's a great way to start. I would encourage you to use the leaf because that's generally the best diagnostic, at least for an app, to be able to tell one species from another. And that's a really good place to start.
Absolutely. I'm going to wait until you mention it before I get into it. I don't. This isn't my podcast. I love this subject, dude. I'm sorry. I love oaks so much. Go ahead.
So I'm gonna I'll jump in the red oaks, and so spoilers that this is absolutely my favorite group. I rarely pay attention to hunting white oaks anymore, for a lot of reasons. But the red oaks, I've killed way more deer from hunting red oaks than I have white oaks, and the seasonality of hunting seems to be a lot better generally, just more hunt days. So looking into the red oaks, we talked about some of the differences before, but I'll just recap it again. Generally, red oaks, or species in the red oak subgroup or subgenus, they will have bristle tips on the end of their lobes. So when you look at a leaf, there's going to be these pointy little protrusions off the end of every lobe. Again, generally, the bark of these species is darker than those of white oak. And again, the acorns take 2 years to mature. The most common red oak that you find all across the East, in the Appalachians, in the Midwest, is northern red oak. And this is something especially old school foresters refer to as just red oak. And so its real name is northern red oak. It has real large acorns. They're about 3/4 of an inch tall to an inch. I found deer really like these. On top of those big acorns, the cap is very flat. It's almost like a little saucer, and it sits on top. My dendrology professor, when I learned trees, said that it looks like a fat man wearing a beret. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, because it does. It just looks like a noggin with a little beret sitting on top. And so that's northern red oak. Northern red oak is a really straight growing tree. It's a really good timber quality tree for that reason. It self prunes well, meaning when you find a northern red oak in the woods, most of the time it's going to have a really long, tall, tapered trunk before it breaks into canopy high up. There are oftentimes what are called ski trails or white stripes down the bark of that tree. And those will normally extend from high up in the canopy to nearly the bottom of the tree. And that is probably the most important diagnostic I use when looking for red oaks for hunting. I will pop up on a ridge, and if it's a northern red oak year and I'm hunting northern red oaks, I will glass that ridge, and I'll find, all right, those are my northern red oaks. They might be anywhere from 40 yards to 200 yards away. And if that's what deer are eating, I'll approach those trees that could be potentially hunt trees more carefully than the rest of the forest. And so again, that bark, like, it's a dead giveaway once you get an eye for it. That's northern red oak. The leaf of a northern red oak, again, it has bristle tips on its lobes, and then the areas between the lobes where it dips in, those are called sinuses. And I don't have a better word to describe it, so I'm going to call them sinuses. Those sinuses aren't that deep. They just kind of come in a little bit in between the lobes. The other species that we find in uplands a lot alongside northern red that looks really similar is scarlet oak. And scarlet oak can be told apart from red oak in a couple of different ways. And the first one, we'll jump back to the leaf. Those sinuses on a scarlet oak are really deep.
Okay.
And generally, if you look at the length from the lobe to the mid vein of that leaf, on a scarlet oak, it will be deeper than halfway. So it'll have these real deep, exaggerated sinuses, which make for really long lobes. That's not the case with northern red oak. The other thing that you'll find with scarlet oak, it will have those white ski trails occasionally, but oftentimes it won't extend down all the way to the ground like it will on northern red oak. You'll see those ski trails higher up on the tree. The more developed bark near the bottom will have a lot more of a kind of like a cobblestone, really tight, dark pattern to it. And most importantly, when I'm looking across the woods, scarlet oaks don't self-prune well. So a tall scarlet oak will oftentimes have knots from old branches, and that old branch will be all curled up and hanging out of the side of the tree, and you'll see those extend all the way down close to the ground.
Oh.
And that is very consistent between those two species. And sometimes whenever I find a leaf on the ground, and it's like, sometimes it's kind of in the middle, and you'll find a tree that it's a northern red oak that has really deep sinuses. You can kind of tell that bark apart, again, using the ski trails and the self pruning of that tree. So that's the best way to tell those apart. Scarlet oak, aptly named, in fall, when it turns color, it will turn a very vibrant dark red, essentially scarlet color. And I've noticed it's not consistent across the board. Some trees don't do it as much. It almost seems site specific, because I know some ridges, like up in Indiana that I hunt, that the whole ridge is scarlet oak, and it'll just be the dark red. And you can actually look back on aerial imagery from October photos on Google Earth and see where there's scarlet oak ridges, because they're dark purple. And whenever I found that timed photography, that lines up well, I can look and I can see this ridge is so dry, it's just scarlet oak on it, and probably chestnut oak. And then, this ridge over here has a lot of lighter colored oaks, a lot of yellows in there. That's northern red oak. Northern red generally turns yellow in the fall, at least in the Midwest. So that's another big difference between those two.
Man, I know how dry it generally is when you find a chestnut oak. So if the scarlets are the ones you're finding there, then that's dry.
Yeah. Yeah, there's rocks. There's exposed rocks on those sites. It's so dry. Which I did fail to mention before, chestnut oak, when we were talking about white oaks, but that's another white oak species. Not to muddy the water too much, but it is a very dry loving species. In the Appalachians, on the top ridge tops, like all you're going to find up there for the most part is chestnut oak and scarlet oak.
Yeah.
Because they're the only trees that can competitively grow out of rock, 50% rock and dirt that gets very little rain.
Yeah.
They're impressive.
It is very impressive.
So, you know, and honestly, from a timber perspective, they're both crap. From a hunting perspective, I've killed deer off scarlet oaks, chestnut oaks. I've very rarely seen deer eat. But regardless, I have so much respect for both of those trees because they grow in places where if those trees weren't there, like it'd be literally rocks and maybe some briars.
Yeah.
That's how poor those sites are.
Yep.
So we'll hop now back to red oaks. One other upland species that's worth mentioning is black oak. And I know the botanists who named all the oaks just they must have hated us because they're just throwing colors all over the place.
We should make a funny video clip about how they first started to name this. Like, we should screw with these guys totally. The white oak is the black, but it's the red. But like, sometimes I feel stupid trying to explain stuff to people or whatever because they're like, well, wait.
I think they started with colors and then they started to realize they had too many oaks and they're like, okay, we're gonna have to do something different, guys. So black oak is a red oak. It's in the red oak group. Black oak is just its name. Its bark is really, really dark. It's the darkest barked of the upland oak species. And in fact, especially after a rain or if you have a really heavy dew or foggy day, the bark will look essentially black from a distance. I mean, I can tell a black oak from hundreds of yards away simply because that bark is so dark colored. Black oak generally has much bigger leaves than the other red oaks, so bigger than northern red oak or scarlet oak. Its leaves are really fuzzy underneath, which is another difference. And then the acorn, it's kind of a medium-sized acorn. The cap of that acorn is unique. It's really hard to describe, with words, but it does look different from some of the others. It's about the size of a scarlet oak acorn. But again, the leaf looks quite a bit different from a scarlet oak. Black oaks, I would say, at least in the areas that I hunt in the Appalachians and in Indiana, they are less common than scarlet oaks. But you'll find one or two on most ridges. They're just not quite as prevalent as the scarlet oaks. And yes, I've killed deer eating black oaks. Even I think I killed one in December or January on black oaks.
Wow.
So you're a big feed tree hunter then?
Oh yeah.
Would you mainly say that the majority, are you killing, all right, I'm going to ask you this and I don't want to seem pompous. Are you killing mature bucks off of these feed trees?
I have not. I have messed up on mature bucks under feed trees though.
Hey, that still kind of counts because a lot of people, it can be difficult to close one out, man. Are you generally getting these deer coming up to food?
I would say yes, but probably the only reason being is that a lot of the times the northern red oaks that I'm hunting or the black oaks or scarlets are pretty high on ridges.
Yeah.
And I try to hunt high just so that I can have a little bit better control over my wind. So
interesting. Okay. I have so much to talk with you about. I'm literally the exact opposite. I hunt deer that drop down to control my wind. But it's all thermal based though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that probably has everything to do with where you're hunting versus where I'm hunting.
Yeah.
And where I'm hunting, it's very tight, like slot-like valleys, and very few of them have running water. When I have running water, I feel I'm dynamite. Like a falling thermal to me is dynamite with running water. But when you start to get, at least where I'm hunting in Indiana, where there's no running water, I start to get a lot more variability in that evening pattern of wind versus the morning and the ridgetop pattern, the rising.
I would say the one sort of caveat to that is I feel like if it's early, you can get away with things. Once the canopy starts to come off,
It
It
changes.
is extremely difficult to really mess with that thermal game. That's why I'm a fan of early season, because you've got, everything's been so hot all day, and as soon as
Yeah.
the sun goes down, the place that's already been shaded is 25 degrees cooler than everything up high. And it's also very interesting. Josh and I got into the scouting thing, and we were in Kentucky in some pretty good hills, not super far from like West Virginia and everything. And same thing, very tight, sort of, almost V bottom areas. And you could literally feel, what was it? I think it was like 10:30 in the morning, super late. It
was almost midday when we were in there.
was hot as balls that day. And the thing to note also is it's very rarely windy in this particular part of the country. And I'm just like cussing left and right because I have no breeze and I hate hot weather to begin with, but
It's very stagnant.
it's very stagnant there. And as we're cruising up this V bottom draw, I just like whisper to him, like, can you feel that? There's just the most minor breeze that if you just turn on your autism for a second, you can tell that something's pouring out. And we actually jumped a pretty big buck that was bedded in the bottom of that draw. And we come up with these theories, and half the time I feel like a moron because you don't hear them much. So I'm like, well, I'm probably just full of crap. Well, I mentioned that I felt like there was a lot more thermal-based bedding than wind-based bedding, because I'm like, well, how are you going to bet on a wind when there's no wind?
Yeah.
And it's really hot and dry up here. There's water, good browse, and a constant every single day down here. This has to make him feel comfortable. And bam, there he was. And I was just like, oh my God, am I a genius right now? Oh, it was pretty cool.
Yeah. I will say to that, where I hunt in Indiana, it's big hills. I find like I find deer bedding high and low, but I find that I can most consistently predict where a deer is going to be bedded low. Whereas high bedding, when they're near a ridge top, it seems a lot more random to me. But those small, and I use CalTopo and their LiDAR data layer to be able to look for very tiny, subtle spurs on the last little 12-foot drop before the creek. That's where I normally find deer beds. That's where I find them bedding early season and in shed season in the snow. That's where I consistently find those beds, and it's down low. So I can't say that's why I hunt up high. Most of the time I hunt up high is just, again, I can kind of control what my wind's doing where I don't think those deer are bedding. And that's where a lot of time where I find those trees to hunt. Yeah.
It sounds like you're kind of pretty good at predicting, I'm assuming, how they're going to come in as well. That's my big sort of weak, my shortcoming, if you will, when I'm hunting up top. Like, I can guess all day, right? But I generally don't have a clue how he's going to travel up. But if he's coming down, I'll be sub 20 yards most of the time from that deer.
Okay.
The one I have to, because I can't hit anything past that. But it's definitely, and the other thing that I'll say is I think it gives me more confidence, because I know that if I put all the dots on the line, get the bed, get the destination food source, and then a few things in between, you get a pretty good direction of travel, and you can pretty much, I don't like to use the word guarantee, but he's going to have to get by you before he beats you with his nose, essentially, or you'll have to be dumb enough to walk up and walk back and, disturb the ground or something. So that's what really attracts me to that, is he's only got his eyes and ears at that point.
Over the last few years, have become a real big believer in hunting side slopes. And when I first started hunting up in Indiana, I was like, everything you hear is, oh, hunt the ridge tops, right? And a hub of ridges and whatnot. And I sat there enough times and watched other hunters walk by with no deer, that I started to pay attention to where I was seeing deer. And so now, to your point and your confidence of a deer dropping down to you, I can't put my finger on if I'm more confident rising, deer rising or falling or whatnot. But one thing over the last couple of years, the only time I actually felt like I had it figured out, is like being able to look at a hillside. And so up there, that hill might drop 150 feet of elevation. It's got a pretty good slope. And at the very bottom, it really drops off sharp. So you kind of got this, the upper part of the slope is maybe 80 or 100 yards from that precipice where it drops down to the bottom to the crest of the ridge. And it used to, me going into it, I was like, man, you got to be within 20 yards to the crest of the ridge. Deer are going to be walking near that, military crest or whatnot. But now I'm about the dead opposite. Every time I set up, I'll stand there and, the paralysis by analysis, the stand on your back and you stand there scratching your head for 30 minutes and you're, where do I sit and shoot? And I pretty much always now will set up as low as I possibly think that I should, and consistently get those deer in bow range. The first time I applied that, I was in Indiana for a week hunting during the rut, and every single deer over a week I saw ended up in bow range. And these are big open hardwoods. You can see 300 yards, and I felt invincible. And I can't say it's worked every time since then, but that was a big game changer for me. And, part of that, that plays into what we're talking about here with the oaks. Every time you find an oak, you've got to figure out, all right, where do I set up? And there's always going to be one side or two that's out of the question because of the wind. You're blowing right underneath that tree. But you will always be faced with a question of, do I sit above that oak or below the oak on the slope? And again, used to, I would have sat on the upper hillside and I've been shooting down low. But now I find myself sitting up below those oaks most of the time because I feel like the deer tend to be lower on those slopes, at least where I hunt. And when you look at that LiDAR, again, going back to that, you look at that LiDAR and those little spur ridges, you can barely call them that. They're actually just washouts going down the side hills. And you look at where that washout starts to get really bad near that drop off. A lot of times the deer are crossing just above that worst washout, and they're crossing across all of those washouts, those little spur ridges.
What is it about that? Like the head of a gully or something, the drainage ditch, whatever you want to, it's different everywhere you go in the country. But I'm pretty sure I'm talking about exactly what you are, around the head of it. Guaranteed. They circumnavigate, having to go down and up and just go around, go a little longer. I mean, you're 100% right. Josh, do you want to tell him go ahead and tell him.
I'm very happy you brought up deer on the side slopes. Chris and I have recently been having this conversation on a particular piece in Kentucky that we both hunt. Just was from hunting it the past year and scouting it the past couple of years. The majority of the mature buck movement always seems to be on the sides of the hills, not up top, not bottom, more that middle third, maybe kind of getting up into the upper third. Anytime I get daylight video of a buck, that is where it's at. And there are a bunch of different oaks on this piece of property. A lot of northern red oaks, there are white oaks, chinkapins, and all that. But there's human pressure as well, I think, plays into it. A lot of the access is up top. And then there's also a lot of recreation in the bottoms. So they're kind of sandwiched in the middle. But that also happens to be where some of the best cover is in the area too. So I think there's a combination of factors there. But I'm glad you brought that up because we are seeing that more and more. I think the more we pay attention to certain areas.
And I think it's mainly, when you really boil it down, there's pressure mainly up top. I would say a lot of people like to stick to the tops of the ridges. It's generally going to be easier until people start listening to how to use thermals. Because if you start messing with the thermal game down low, they can get pretty sick pretty quick, we'll say. But the side of the hill to me is kind of really tough because there's more, there's a lot to hunt there. Generally you're going to run into a little more vegetation and stuff like that. in my experience anyway, with like the crappy stuff that you don't like. Honeysuckle here sucks.
Yeah.
So, and they're able to move within cover and essentially right in between the pressure without ever being seen or, detected in any way. So, it makes sense. He started talking about this. He was picking up deer in daylight left and right, and it wasn't, and up top, and it wasn't in the bottom either. And so I started going back to all the places I was picking up deer, and I'm like, Josh, dude, same damn thing. It's very interesting. And for me, you can pretty much take it to the bank that there's going to be some form of creek, ditch, something that's going to carry a thermal, little bit of wind or something in there somewhere. It's pretty crazy.
Well, I can tell you the most predictable thing about ridge tops where I hunt is there's at least 1 or 2 ladder stands on each one.
Every single one.
Every single, and I just drop pins, and I've done this for years. Every time I find a ladder or hang on or whatnot, I'll drop a pin. And whenever I started to come to this conclusion, I started to look back at all those pins, and I was like, oh, ridge. So if I'm a deer, where am I going to be?
Right.
I'm not where all the hunters always are.
Not on the wide open ridge top where everybody always is. I mean, imagine, when you watch those deer that are keyed up and a weird noise happens that you didn't make, and you watch their skin twitch and stuff, they're keyed up. So imagine thinking that something's going to kill you every moment of your life and then trying to avoid that. You're basically, as Don Higgins always says, you're asking him to willingly commit suicide to come up there without some form of wind advantage. And what's crazy is the times I have hunted a ridgetop, and it's not been because I was like, ooh, let's go hunt on the ridgetop. Is the only damn place I could get in a tree. But I could hear, and I can't say that I visually saw the deer, but by what the deer was doing to me, I know that it was probably a mature buck or darn close, because they just walked down there on the bench where you can't see them and scent check the entire ridgetop. And then, in the evening with the thermals falling, and then they come up. And so that's really taught me a lot here lately. Just understanding how they're physically able to use their nose. And what blows my mind is I find a bunch of big deer that drop down, and it's literally their downfall. Like I don't think they'd die very often if they didn't drop down. Not for me anyway. I would never kill them because they drop down with an eyesight advantage, and they literally don't have the wind in their favor in any way out in front of them. And so I'm sitting there, and it's pretty much, I've seen it a few times and even have it on video. The look on his face when you're where you've never been and shouldn't be and nobody's ever been, it's priceless. It's crazy. Anyway, back to Oaks.
I figured we could go back, and you had mentioned this before we got into the different like subspecies and all that. You talked about masting events and that. So maybe we can head on when these oaks tend to generally kind of drop, and then maybe we could also hit on, like, I don't know, I've found white oaks in areas, and it just seems like 3 or 4 or 5 years goes by, and it's like, well, they're not producing. Why are these not producing? Why are these producing? And maybe we could go down that road a little bit.
Can I ask one question before, because I wanted to kind of dive back in a little bit to the different oaks. Would you, and we were going on a broad perspective here, would you say that the pin oak is more localized, or is that a pretty big across the board tree?
It's definitely a Midwestern and Mississippi, upper Mississippi River Valley. So it's actually, if you get down in the South and you say pin oak, everybody down there thinks,
not all.
When they think of a pin oak, they're thinking actually of a willow oak, which is one of the bottomland red oaks.
Okay.
Very, very, very different species. But yeah, the pin oak is more of a Midwestern thing.
How about a shingle oak?
Also very Midwestern.
Okay.
Yeah. And both of those being somewhat bottomland species, especially pin oak being a very bottomland species in the Midwest.
Yeah, they like it wet.
Mhm.
Yeah, they don't have those down south, but down south we've got shoe-marred oak and
Okay.
nut-all oak are a couple real common oaks to hunt down there. I've hunted those, and they're very fun to hunt.
Heard a lot about the
Yeah.
nut-all. The
Yeah.
shingle oak is very interesting. It doesn't look like an oak leaf at all to me.
Yeah, it is a weird one because it doesn't really have lobes.
It looks darn
Almost,
near. You go ahead.
it almost looks like sawtooth, but without the toothing on the margin, which is
Yeah.
which is actually an Asian oak. That's neither a red oak nor a white oak. It's it's in its own group from Asia.
Wow.
Sawtooth oak, which is commonly planted.
Oh my God. Like every plant that comes from Asia takes over. Everything that from Asia comes over here and like kills things off or something. It's insane.
That one's not near as invasive as some others, but I'm definitely not as in love with it as some managers are for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Mainly selectivity. I mean, it's been shown deer don't generally prefer it very much to others, but
okay.
yeah, not to digress too much, but yeah, there's a whole lot of oaks out there, and that kind of gets to this next point of oak masting events.
Okay.
And just to define that, most oaks will produce a few acorns every year. A true masting event, and this is actually an ecological term, is that bumper crop when you're walking underneath that oak and it's like marbles underneath. So when I say masting from now on, this is going to be one of those, it's an event, right? It's like, wow, that year we had all those white oaks. In general, and this is a rule of thumb, it's probably wrong every time, but it kind of gets you in the neighborhood, is that red oaks will generally have a big mast event every 5 years or so, white oaks generally every 3 years or so. Now I said that, you can throw that out the window because it's different every time.
Yeah.
But those mast events are really important for oaks, and this was part of my thesis research. It's thought, and this is one of the theories around oak reproduction and regeneration of oaks, is that those masting events are an oak's way of overwhelming all of its predators, the deer, the squirrels, the bears, giving out, throwing out so many seeds, so many acorns that they can't eat them all. And that is why usually those masting events are species specific. Now, sometimes you'll see a couple different species have a masting event that probably just overlap by coincidence. But if if red oaks are having a masting event, all the red oaks are going to be having a masting event. They're synchronized that way by species. Now, not all oak trees are created equal in their reproductive ability. Some really cool research that was done years ago in Tennessee showed that about a third of oak trees will produce 75% of the acorns. And it's just like with deer genetics. Some deer are more predisposed to have really large bodies. Others are predisposed to have very large antlers. Same with humans. Like, we're all different, right? Well, the same with oak trees. And I say that because there can be a really big mast event, and you might find a handful of red oak, northern red oaks on this ridge top, and they're slammed with acorns. And I've seen this myself. A few hundred yards up the ridge, there might be another northern red oak that there's 50, 100 acorns. Meanwhile, those other trees, they're producing a few thousand apiece. And that's just variability within the species. Just different individuals produce better than others. So, but back to that timing of masting. Each species has these masting events every few years, right? And when we have some of those really bad springs for acorn production, that can knock out all the species for a year or two. Again, with that offset between white oak and red oak on the timing. Generally, what's thought to have a very large contributing effect on oak production is frost timing. And a frost happening when those flowers are vulnerable and therefore aborting that crop of acorns. There are other factors at play, other environmental factors, drought, wind, all there's a whole host. I forget, it's something like 8 different factors that are thought to play into whether or not a tree masts. And forest ecologists have been trying to nail down and build some grand model that would be able to predict when oaks are going to mast. And so far that has not happened. So it is honestly something you kind of got to learn every year, which is really the fun of it. From a hunting perspective, every single fall, I will resurvey, I'll look at a few different trees of each species and try to figure out what's masting. And then from there, for the most part, what you're going to run into, even in different areas. Sometimes that doesn't hold true as well as it should. I've seen, a few counties kind of be outliers that in these counties, northern red oaks did really good. But if I'm on the forest over here, an hour down the road, it's like, they kind of did so-so. So there can be some geographic, variation, but again, that's probably has something to do with some kind of a weather event that happened in spring, that made a bunch of those flowers get aborted. But for the most part, what I will do is I'll figure out what masted. Let's say it's northern red oak. Then back to my example before, I'm going to be looking for northern red oaks throughout season. And even if there's not feeding sign underneath them when I find them, I will make a note, really good, acorn production, northern red oak, and I'll move on. And then I'll check back on those trees throughout the season. And inevitably at some point, those trees will get hit real hard by a deer. Sometimes it's during deer season. Sometimes it's not till February, March, or somewhere in late winter. But again, once you can kind of identify oaks and you can figure out which species did mast, suddenly you can throw out 80% of oaks in the forest. You're no longer hunting oaks. You're hunting black oaks. And that really helps you narrow it down, because if you're hunting black oaks, when you look at the national forest, like where I'm hunting, few 100-foot elevation gain all over the place. It's nothing but endless hills. I can immediately throw out 80% of the forest because it is too low on slopes to have black oaks. The black oaks are going to be on that upper third. So right there, I already know. Well, then I can look at my aerial imagery. I can see, all right, this is young forest, 30, 40 years old. I know that's going to be a bunch of big tooth aspen, tulip poplar, and sweet gum. I can throw that out. And then I, narrow it down. These are pines, throw that out. And that at least gives you areas to look at. That's way better than walking through the woods, looking around, looking for acorns.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're actually hunting them.
Ruling out ground is a very undervalued thing, and that's what I feel like for the first few years. That's all I did was rule places out.
Yeah.
Now they're not here.
Yeah, but that's just as valuable as the other.
Yeah,
It is. But that's really good information. I've never thought to do that, because I remember that place we were talking about earlier in Kentucky where the deer are using side hilling a lot. Man, I've wasted an entire day trying to check every single white oak in a given area, and I'm just like, nope, let's move to the next one. Nope. Even on the same ridge, like trying to glass them all up just to see if there's any oaks. So that is good information. So sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Your contention is that if just the white oak, the regular white oak, if one white oak's dropping real heavy here and another white oak's dropping, you can pretty much bank that it's the white oaks this year. And then same for, let's say northern red. If the northern red's dropping bombs over here, then look for northern reds, and so that's how you're kind of ruling things out.
Yep. And understand there could be exceptions, but for the most part, they're really well synchronized.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. Now.
So, and to circle back, this might be a little redundant, but while we're on this note, I'm going to go through a couple of these. If it's a scarlet oak year, and we just had one of these recently, it's about 2 or 3 years ago, I was hunting in the mountains in North Carolina, and the scarlet oaks were like marbles on the ground. Scarlet oaks are really high on slopes, like we talked about, really dry sites. So those are going to be really high on slopes. Those will be on some of the rougher terrain. That's where it does the best because it can outcompete. Northern red oak, I find those generally on better soils. So like up in Indiana, it's not going to be high on the really dry ridges, but some upper ridges will carry a lot of northern red oak if it's good, deep soil.
Mhm.
And I'll kind of noted that over the years, like, all right, this ridge top is covered in what, white oak proper and northern red oak and so on. Our bottomland species, those are pretty easy. Like, you're going to have to look for them down in the bottomlands. And so if it's a swamp chestnut oak here, you don't need to be worrying about walking around up in the hills, because that's not where you're going to find those trees.
Yeah.
So you can, those are a few real obvious ones, but just like that, like, trees do have a specific set of conditions that they need. We could call it northern red oak habitat. Really, it's just the soil and hydrology conditions they need to survive, and you can get a feel for that on your property pretty quickly.
Can you, I know this is a blanket question, but I'm going to ask it because I'm hoping to know. With a white or a red, is there a time of year, like a month out, 2 months out from dropping, where you feel like you can look up with some 10 by 42, 12 by 50s, whatever, and say, that tree has plenty of acorn, like, we need to make a note of this tree. Like right now, could you glass white oaks and say that white oak's going to drop good, or vice versa?
With binoculars, typically August, you can tell pretty well.
Okay.
Acorns are really good at hiding. So, if I'm doing an early season like that, I'll look at a lot of different trees, just because, like, my eyes and, like, there's a lot of factors. But the easiest way is if you have a storm come through and blow some limbs out, like, that is a foolproof. And you can do that in June. Like, you can look and be like, okay, yeah, we got some acorns.
Cheat code.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then typically a few weeks to a month before acorns really drop proper, you're going to have some acorns dropping, and those are just aborts. A lot of times those are those will be acorns that had some kind of an issue, like they might have an acorn weevil in them or something like that, and those aborts will start to drop. And that would be another good sign that you have a crop coming.
Okay.
That's good.
So that is why okay.
And a lot of times those are green. Those will be real green acorns. There's, like, you start to get real excited, but there's nothing really eating them. Typically, those are the aborts.
Right around the end of July, early August, it seems like every year there are places I can go where I'll find green red oak acorns laying on the ground, which, you talking about them hiding very well. It's why I like chinkapin oaks so much. They're like a black when they start to turn ripe, and I can just, bam, pick them out. Super easy.
I had a thought, and then I lost it with that. I got it. It came back to me. When you're scouting, and when you identify a tree that is going to drop, in general, because I feel like, and I'll just use this as an example. So last year, when I was glassing up northern red oaks in different areas, and it was, I would say, a bumper crop year. There was lots and lots of northern red oaks that were holding acorns, and I was seeing them drop all the way the very beginning of October, and just a ridge over, and then I hunted the ridge next to it. This would have been after Veterans Day, so like that mid-November, and I was sitting in a tree, and I had northern red oak acorns hit me in the head as I was sitting there.
Yeah.
So there was a very large time frame in which they were dropping. So in general, when you find these trees that are dropping acorns, white or red, when do you tend to see deer kind of target those? Is it right when, so like a white oak, for example, we'll just use the general white oak. When those drop, are the deer going to hit those right away? Because in general, I feel like people, when they talk about reds, they'll drop, and then because of the tannins and that, they say they won't hit them for a few months or something.
Yeah. I think the answer is there's probably it depends a lot. It changes year to year, and I hate to even say there's any general rule of thumb, because every time I thought there was one, it gets thrown out the window. Every year is so different. In my case in point, I generally do feel that white oaks are hit pretty early. Like I feel like that is, of all the trends out there, that's usually pretty consistent. But here's a couple disclaimers. One year in Mississippi, so the acorns in Mississippi drop end of October, beginning of November. It was first week in November. The deer are just out of their bachelor groups. Like it's nothing's happening. And swamp chestnut oaks and white oaks raining down everywhere. The year before I shot deer under those trees, acorns were laying, nothing happening. And I found a cherry bark oak just up the draw, which is a red oak species. It has very small acorns. The deer were wearing it out. And the first evening I sat it, I shot a pretty nice buck under it. And he was, I think, the second or third buck to visit that evening.
Wow.
And so there's an example of they were walking right past the white oaks to go to the red. A few years ago, I was in Indiana for late season, the last week of archery. If I have a tag, I love hunting that whenever a gun goes out and it's archery right at the end, there's no one around. And that year there was black oaks, and actually I ended up killing that's the year I killed a doe underneath one of those black oaks. I think it was December 30th or whatever. But that same week there was active feeding sign on white oak acorns that were still on the ground. And the most interesting thing about this is that those white oak acorns had already germinated. They had about a 1-inch root. All of them had a 1-inch root on them. And I had traditionally, I don't know where I got this belief. I probably thought it up in my sleep one night. Years ago, I thought the deer didn't eat acorns that had already germinated. It didn't make sense to me,
thought.
you know. And I was like, okay, well, once they germinate, you can rule them out. And I've even said similar things about white oaks. But again, case in point, every year's kind of an exception. But to circle back to it, the timing of acorn drop is something you can definitely count on with different species. White oak, Quercus alba, is generally one of the first to drop. And up where you're at and where I hunt in Indiana and in that area and in the Appalachians, scarlet oak will be kind of a mid-season drop, think October or whatnot. And northern red oak, while you will find trees that drop in October, I've seen northern red oaks dropping that same time frame you were talking about, even into the 1st of December.
Yeah.
If we were down in the deep south, Shumard oak is that way. It's dropping in December, maybe into January a little bit, and the same with Nuttall. And the cool thing about this is if you get to hunt a property over years, you will actually identify trees that have different timing, and that is actually pretty consistent with that tree itself. And I first noticed this years ago with persimmons. There's a persimmon right now I could take you to in Mississippi that will still have all of its fruit on it Christmas week.
Oh,
Well,
wow.
on that same property, a few hundred yards away, I shot a doe open a week of bow season in October, eating persimmons, a different tree. So that does kind of, like, it varies by tree. And so I don't know. I can't say for sure if fresh acorns really have any more appeal than ones that have been on the ground for a while, because I've seen deer eat very fresh ones and very old ones. And there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to it. But those late dropping ones I like, because at least even if it's not the act of the acorn dropping that's pulling in deer, which I think you could probably argue is a pretty good cue to deer, there's food there. But let's say that wasn't even a cue. A late dropping tree, that's guaranteed food on the ground right then, and it's right on top of the leaves.
Yep.
And so, like, I know a ridge in Indiana that when it's a good northern red oak year, I'll be there, because at the end of November, those things are just then dropping. And taking note of that can be beneficial, especially if all the other red oaks have already been eaten up by that time, because then it's the only game in town.
I'm really glad that you're saying what you're saying, because I feel like just in the few years of trying to learn all this, I've people talk about oaks like it's a certainty, like, oh yeah, whites drop early, they're going to eat them early, then you get reds drop later, they'll eat them later, they won't eat them when they hit first at the ground, they'll eat them like months later. And like, I'm seeing deer hit northern red oak acorns early October. Like I was just talking about, I had that tree drop in middle of November. I was like, man, I am not seeing these quote unquote consistencies that people talk about. It just seems kind of very all over the board. And what I've in my head personally, I think the best thing you can do is go back to your scouting, like you've talked about, and just marking these trees, identifying when they're dropping, when the deer are eating them, because it does vary.
Yeah.
You know what else that makes me think of? The forbs and grasses. Just, I mean, I think that might be the only consistent thing in the entire deer hunting world that seems to just year after year, unless of course it's, crazy psycho drought or something like that. But I mean, we generally don't have anything that affects it that bad for the most part. But because I was just sitting here thinking when you literally are like, well, I'd love to give you a general rule, but there really isn't one. And I'm like, can I just be comfortable once with anything? Like, I think that's probably why I like the thermal game so much, because there's consistency to it. And in a world where there's no consistency to anything else, Captain Autism over here is like, okay, I don't like change. It's crazy.
And the cool thing about deer, if you can embrace uncertainty, it's the same way even with forb selection. I mean, I make a living managing properties to grow deer, growing plants that grow deer. And there are a lot of plants that we, through research, have identified as being highly selected for deer. And nutritionally, they are excellent nutrition, very digestible. And I have seen deer walk right by those to eat some of the poorest quality forage right next to them. And the reason, this is me getting into hypotheses, there's an excellent book on this topic called Nourishment by Fred Provenza, who's a grazing ecologist. And he has written this book about ruminants, not about deer, about cows and about sheep and about goats. And it goes into the background of how these animals make food selections. And the nutritional quality, or optimizing high nutrition, is about as important in them deciding whether they're going to eat that acorn as much as the quality of the last bite they took on, a plant down the hill or a mushroom or whatever they ate. That affects that choice just about as much, because while they might eat that acorn that's full of carbs, if they have already had a very high carb diet for whatever reason, suddenly they don't need carbs. And while that's still a great morsel of food sitting there, what they're really looking for is something that's high in protein or high in fat. And so anytime we try to come up with these, consistent deer eat this, deer don't eat that, or, anytime someone starts to tell you that, you might want to run the other way, because we love to come up with those types of trends, especially someone in the deer management world, because then it makes us sound smart. If I tell you deer are always going to do this, then it's like, oh, wow, he must know everything about deer, right? But if you're honest with yourself, the world's full of exceptions. You can notice norms, but the most important thing you can do from a woodsman or a manager's perspective is learn how to identify what deer are using and how that changes, and then adapt to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the best example of that is, this acorn hunting, or hunting deer over acorns. One thing that people will say as a rebuttal to everything we've talked about here, why deer eat white oaks over red oaks? They will tell you all of this doesn't make sense because white oaks are lower in tannin and they're sweeter than red oaks. I think we've probably all heard that. Again, back to that book I referenced. Humans have been programmed to make food selections off of how sweet it is. Let's be honest. We live in a world where if you go and this gets me, I go out west and I hunt, and before I go and hunt, I'll buy some of those little tuna packets to take with me because they're ready to go. There's sugar added to that.
Yep.
Why is there sugar added to it? Well, because humans have a very good adaptive response to sugar. It makes us want to eat more of it, because long-term, millennia ago, sugar was very limited. It was one of the limited resources. So when we found sugar on the landscape, that was a cue to our brain that we need more of that food, sugar and fat both, somewhat limited. And so when we talk about deer, like they're making food selections the same way, well, there we've shown our ignorance, because we're just taking what we understand in our head, what we think we know about our food selection, and applying it to deer. Back to red oaks and white oaks, both of them have tannins in them. Most of the food deer eat has tannins in them. tannins are just one of many different secondary plant compounds that plants put in their tissues, whether that's seeds in the case of acorns or leaves or stems, to discourage herbivory. And so those tannins, yes, they're off-putting, especially to our mouth, and they can hinder the digestion or the digestibility of that food to deer. But luckily, deer have proteins in their saliva that bind with those tannins that make that food more digestible because they're adapted to eating those tannins. This isn't their first rodeo. Oaks aren't, doing something the deer haven't already prepared for.
Sure.
Now, there's probably some kind of an interplay there where higher density of tannins might affect how well that deer can digest its food. I'm only aware of research done on the saliva of deer and how it binds with those tannins. There's probably other ways down the road in the rumen where deer can also affect the free and loose tannins that they're digesting so that they can get more out of those foods. So the tannin explanation to me is an armchair way of explaining something better than we think, better than we probably actually know it.
Mm-hmm.
It is real. It is part of the equation, but it's not the only part.
Dude, this is awesome.
That hits a nerve with me, in case you're wondering.
Yeah,
When people say that,
it's
because there's so much to it, and that's the cool part.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting though is, and we kind of hit on this probably multiple times already, but so many people make these blanket statements, like there's a certainty and they're just, I can't get comfortable, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is no real certainty. So now you got me nervous because I had a spot in Kentucky with a burn, and the feed sign there was better than any bean field I'd looked in. It was unreal. And just a super diverse mix of all kinds of different stuff. And there were deer pouring into that 2 hours before dark. Saw multiple good bucks in it. Had some really big ones on camera as well. And I'm wondering if I'll even find them there this year.
I bet it does change.
Mm-hmm.
I bet it does change. And I will say this, in the case of burns, generally after a major disturbance like that, the most of the plants that come in there are annuals. They'll die that once, they'll go to seed, and then if let's say 80% of the plant growth in an area after a burn or any kind of major disturbance is annuals, the next year it'll be like 10 or 20%. And most of the plants that will come in are a lot more perennials that are just going to be there year after year. A lot of those perennials are eaten by deer, but what time of year was that burn done? Was it a spring or summer burn?
Spring, late winter, early spring.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you probably had a lot of annuals, and honestly, they should have been senescing, drying up in late summer where they wouldn't have had that much draw by that point in the year. So
lush green into September. Unreal. I'll send you a video in Messenger. It was, I walked in there and I had originally chosen to try to get above it to catch this buck coming down, but it was, a pretty good piece. And I thought, how many deer am I going to have to bump to get up there? And I had great deer coming in there in broad daylight. So I was like, what? I'm going to sit on this, especially if I can find a good tree to get up in. Why not? And
right.
I mean, it was, I wanted to eat the damn things. They were so succulent looking. Like when you looked at the feed sign, you could just see like the moisture and everything coming out from. I had looked at some where they literally just bit it off within the last hour. So it was unreal, man.
Yeah. It's again a rule of thumb that there are some exceptions to. Most annual plants, those first years, there's a lot more high nutrition, highly digestible plants that are annuals than perennials. So I expect deer will be using that this year, but I wouldn't expect the same level of response because that was. You think, is this a really forested area?
It's pretty diverse.
Yeah, it's really diverse. Like, so you can get into hubs and hills and then not just a couple 100 yards away, vast, wide open canopy with a mix here and there. You'll have like a drainage ditch coming down the hill that's got trees on both sides for 20 yards on each side or whatever. But
Okay.
I mean, it's where you'd go to flush woodcock and rabbits and stuff like that. Like it's thick, blackberry briar, lot of goldenrod. But when I got out of the goldenrod and into basically a bunch of different stuff, there's where the deer were.
Yeah. It sounds like a fun place.
It is it's fun. We find
Yeah, that makes me want to go back because same piece. It's a pretty large one, but a different section of it. They burned a lot there this year, back in late February. So now, when you were just talking about the annuals and perennials, now I want to go back and really check it because this was first time it had been burned in a while. So
you should just walk through during an evening like now, and you'll see everything you need to see, and everything can be calmed down by, deer season. You can put cams up, but that's the problem. That's the caveat with those places where you're going to put a camera.
Yeah.
You ain't finding trees to hang them on, so you really got to get super creative.
maybe I'll go after like a rain. That way I can see tracks real well.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what I'll do.
Then go check the hills for some knocked out acorns, some oak abortions.
Moriah, I want to be cognizant of your time because I know, like I told you at the beginning, Chris and I will just keep chatting about the subject. It is a favorite subject of ours. Is there anything else that you would like to hit on? The only other note I have on my list here is habitat, like disturbance and management, and how that might affect any oak masting or anything like that. Like if you get rid of like some competing species, like if it helps them or not. I don't know if you have time to maybe hit on that real quick.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, just I guess the note that I would drive home, we've already talked about a little bit here, is that you can hunt oaks all through the season. And if you're in a big wood setting, especially, that's probably the best thing you have to hunt. You can start hunting them early. Quite honestly, I love hunting oaks late because the later it gets in the season, the more oaks have been eaten and the more deer become concentrated in the certain patches that still have acorns.
Mm-hmm.
I found great success doing that. And, I've run cameras in some of the spots after killing a deer and seen a lot of activity, including mature bucks in those sites. Those can be really killer all the way through the end of season. And I've seen that, down south. I've seen that up in Indiana. Don't discount oaks when you get late in the season. And when you're out scouting, and we didn't really touch on this before, you guys have probably mentioned this on the podcast before. If you're looking for a deer sign underneath an oak, most obvious sign from a distance is chopped up leaves and just disturbance in the leaves. But the best way that I've found to have confidence that you've got deer in there is that you'll find acorns that have been chewed on that are still laying there. So they'll have molar marks on them. They might be crushed in half. Those are a really good sign that deer are using it. My taking it a step further, rule of thumb, when I start to get excited, and this honestly applies to any kind of hunting, when I find oaks and I find deer pellets underneath, if a deer's spending enough time there that it is defecating, right? If a deer's crapping underneath the tree, it's spending enough time, or there's been enough deer use there for that to happen. Again, it's kind of just become my rule of thumb. I see sign all over the place. You find trails, you find areas where deer are milling around and whatnot. You think they're bedding or whatever. When you start to get different piles of deer crap, that means that deer are spending a certain amount of time there to be able to do that. And I really applied that to hunting oaks. There was something else you asked there about about management. Yes, yeah. There has been research done on that. Absolutely, releasing oak crowns, it will increase their productivity. Acorn productivity. And so imagine you've got an oak growing in the forest. Let's just say it's bounded on four sides by trees. Usually what I will tell landowners, the first step is to go in there, if you have a mixed oak, non-oak forest, is to remove the non-oaks around those trees. And really you just got to worry about 3 sides of the tree: the east side, south side, and west side. The north side, you're really not freeing up much in the way of resources, because that tree, the oak's actually shading that tree. That tree's not shading the oak. So what you're really trying to do is increase available sunlight, so that that canopy can grow larger. The larger the canopy, the more oak production there will be. If you spend, time in a park, you can go to the Target parking lot. If it's old enough and there are oaks there that produce, the best acorn production you see will be in those little islands of oaks at the bank, wherever, where you have a lone oak tree or 2 spaced far apart. Why is that? Well, it's got all the resources it could ever need, and it doesn't have competition. And this has been shown through research down, again, University of Tennessee, and I won't try to quote the numbers because I don't know them off the top of my head, but where they went in and they released the canopies of those oaks and drastically increased acorn production of those trees, and they measured that, where they were able to produce more oak or more acorns from those trees. Even more interestingly, by identifying, again, remember I said that there's 1/3 of the oaks from that same research, about 1/3 of the oaks produce 75% of the acorns. Those are really the trees that you need to be focusing on. So if we have time from a management, perspective on a property, we will watch certain trees. We'll flag trees as good producers. And whenever we have that big mast year, which ones are producing the most? More importantly, which ones aren't producing anything? Because those can go too. There's nothing great, there's nothing magical about an oak tree. As hunters, I think we all think about oaks kind of being synonymous with deer, that 2 go hand in hand. But if we're talking about it from a land management perspective, a good oak tree, one of those good producers, is going to produce a lot of food for about a month, every 3 years. Now they might eat it throughout the rest of winter, but there's only food dropping for a few weeks to a month every 3 years. And so it's one thing to keep those trees and to release those crowns and help them produce. Most of the time, if we do that on a property we're managing, that's really for hunting, because we're able to produce way more tonnage more consistently in managed openings or managed forest or a food plot than whatever we produce on that oak every 3 years. But again, from the hunting perspective, the best thing to do would be to remove the non-oaks that are competing with those crowns, and then any poor quality oaks that are competing with those crowns. And by doing that, you can absolutely increase acorn production.
That's awesome. That we kind of hit on this point a little bit with Mark Turner, when we talked about areas that are kind of managed, doing good management practices. Chris and I hunt some areas, in different states, or different management areas are different, but some do a really good job, where they're doing select cutting, burns, and stuff like that. Chris and I have scouted areas where they went in and select cut and also burned, and then you have where they basically open it up around these different oak trees and different areas. So I'm glad that the thought I had in my head of them producing more is accurate, because that gives, I think, people something to target if they're going in on, like, let's say a public land that's managed. It's like, oh, let me check this area where I know they've done a select cut or some type of management. Look at the oaks there compared to some of the other ones.
Yeah. And the other thing too that also plays into that is if a forest has been pretty aggressively thinned, you're also producing 500, 800 pounds of good quality deer forage underneath.
Mm-hmm.
Combine that in with burning, and then you also have a boost in the plant community. You're going to have more diversity underneath. So that's another draw to those deer, not to mention the cover that gives them on the ground. So there's many benefits to getting disturbance in there, and you can have both, in the same forest patch.
Yep. Provides good bedding cover. Those are the spots I tend to check more often than not.
Yeah.
I described your some of your spots that I know pretty well to a T, actually. If you're not cussing when you walk through these places, you're probably not on big deer, because it's always briars this, thorns that, and just it's terrible.
Yeah,
but there's big deer there.
There's truth to that. It's not always, and sometimes it is. The farther you go, the better it gets. But a lot of times, it might be that you're walking a long ways, or it might be that you're cussing the whole way and it's
Yeah.
only a few hundred yards.
Literally,
The harder it is to get there.
what kind of idiot am I? Why am I doing this to myself? And then you get there and you're like, oh, baby.
Yeah.
It's
Or
something,
straight up a hill,
Yeah.
mountain, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
especially in those real pressured areas, just something that'll deter most hunters, and those deer feel like they can get away from the pressure. I mean, they don't have to go very far. Heck, I found some of the best bucks I have on camera are not far from a road,
No.
right? It's just they are going around the pressure in this spot. It's pretty wild when you think about it.
We were talking about hunting Indiana, and you just mentioned the going straight up a hill. I was looking over a map with a buddy, and he's like, "Man, that's pretty steep. I don't know." And I was like, it ain't that bad." And I showed up, and it had been cut, select cut, and it was fairly moist, and it was very steep. And I had my bow on the back of my pack, so I'm in this, big timber, but also there's like a secondary canopy with a bunch of tiny little poplar and maple saplings and all that. And so they're all catching my pack and my bow and my face and everything while I'm trying to get footing. And so I ended up having to crawl on my hands and knees just to get up the hill. And I'll add that there was no shortage of briars everywhere to catch you on the face or arm or whatever. And it was a nightmare. And the whole way up, I'm just like, you just drove 3 hours to hate life. This is crazy.
Yeah. I think sometimes the hills of Indiana are a little underestimated. That reputation is well earned in Southeast Ohio.
Yes, it is.
There's some decent hills in Southern Indiana too.
Yeah. Well, that's why I really kind of was a little arrogant, because I was like, I literally said, "It's Indiana, buddy." And then I was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, because it wasn't tall, but it was just steep.
Yeah. But once you get up there, again, that gets you past the people most of the time.
Yeah.
A lot of those ladder stands are on the same ridge you can park on.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You got to be able to walk out from where you park.
Yeah.
Well,
and then here's another thing I think plays into that. Not to get too tangential, but a lot of folks up there, at least, they pretty much all drag their deer out. They're a big field dressing group. That's one thing I learned living and working in Indiana for DNR. Everyone field dresses. We're in the South, you take it whole and you take it back. Everyone just throws in the back of the pickup because it's 90 pounds. But up there, it's field dressing on public land the same. And so if you're willing to, I quarter everything. It doesn't matter how far I am from the truck. I'm going to quarter it when I get home to process it. So I quarter it in the field.
Absolutely.
And that opens up so much. Because think about it, if you were having to climb up that hill the opposite way, dragging a deer, you would never go down there.
No.
And so I think a drop off in areas like that can be just as discouraging to hunters, because they're smart. They're like, well, I'm going to have to drag the deer up to get out too.
Yep.
Yeah.
People like an easy button.
You aren't kidding there.
Well, Moriah, we have hit on literally every topic that I had written down here. This has been a wonderful conversation, one that Chris and I have been really anxious to have for years now. I just want to thank you very much for your time today, because this has been great.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the invite. I enjoyed it. And as you can guess, I love thinking and talking about this topic as well. It's pretty much what I'm thinking about for 4 months out of the year while I'm hunting. So I think it's one of those things where we talk about woodsmanship all the time as hunters. And I think it's one of those things where it's a skill that requires practice, just even identifying trees. But if you can get in the mindset where you enjoy it, it's really rewarding, even if it doesn't kill you a deer right away. Just being able to know more about your surroundings and appreciate it. The more plants or trees this is just my own personal experience, the more I appreciate being outside, because I see more diversity than just green. When I can appreciate something rare, I like it more.
Yep.
Definitely agree.
You're not walking like, oh, tree. You're really breaking things down. And again, the whole connection starts with understanding what everything is and what part it plays. So, and I think it makes each deer, to me, it's helped make deer more special. Like even when you kill a doe, not to keep storytelling or anything, but first time I ever took my father-in-law on public land and kind of scouted our way in. We had scouted a couple weeks prior and kind of knew a general area to go, but everything was very different. Different acorns were dropping and everything by then, and we just found a spot where we had seen feed sign, and the oaks were dropping, and so we set up. And I mean, we didn't even get set up, and deer were starting to pour in, hours before dark, and he ended up spooking the first one because we weren't even set up yet. And then right after that, a group of 6 does comes down, and he shot one, and he just thought it was the coolest thing ever because of how we did it. We all, like Josh said, hunted over corn and stuff on private, and even when you didn't hunt over corn, you're not able to put as much thought into it as you are on public because you can walk around and look more. You don't have the oaks, you're not gonna have them, especially when it's not your property. So it helps you appreciate a lot.
Yep, exactly. Well, Moriah, where can people find out more about you and what you're doing with like wildlife investments and all that?
Yeah, so mostly Instagram. My Instagram is Moriah_Biologist, and spell my name Moriah. And then as far as the company Wildlife Investments, we're just Wildlife Investments. That's our handle on Instagram, and we're constantly trying to put out information that's helpful to landowners. And honestly, if you're interested in deer, there's everything there too. To learn more about what deer are eating, and even if you can't manipulate what's out there on the areas you're hunting, we're always trying to post cool, interesting factoids, observations, anecdotes, results from research and application on there. So that's where you can find us, and that's what I'm doing nowadays, and that is with private properties. But everything I learn out there, I'm always applying everything that I learn while I'm hunting, I'm applying on the management side, and vice versa. So they both go hand in hand quite well.
Yep. I would recommend, because I follow along that page too, and there's a bunch of what I would call heavy hitters as far as the biologist standpoint on there, and a lot of really good information comes from that page. So if you get a chance for our listeners, follow that page. There's a lot of good stuff on there. But again, Moriah, thank you very much for hopping on today. And for everyone, this has been the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and you're listening to the Whitetail Apprentice Series. Thanks for tuning in.